We've had an incredible 24 hours in the United States. I want to start today with huge news out of Minneapolis, where the other three officers, as they are known, involved in the death of George Floyd, have now been charged, and the charges against Derek Chauvin have been upgraded from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. A lot to discuss. So starting off with, reminder, Derek Chauvin is the officer in the viral video that spurred the national and even global protests. The officer putting his knee to George Floyd's neck for many minutes before George Floyd ultimately died. The three officers visible in the video sort of standing around as this happens have now been charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder and aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter. Second-degree murder and aiding and abetting second-degree murder punishable by up to 40 years in prison. Manslaughter, aiding and abetting manslaughter, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Now let's talk about the Derek Chauvin charges. And there's a lot of detail here that's important. The original charges against Derek Chauvin were third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The murder charge has now been upgraded to second-degree murder. This is very important because second-degree murder carries with it, number one, a much more serious potential sentence, but also, number two, potentially a more difficult to prove case for the prosecution, in a sense, sort of maybe, except that the third-degree murder charges, when you look at the statute, also may not have been the right ones for the situation. So again, we've got to look at what the statutes say. In Minnesota, a third-degree murder charge is defined as, quote, whoever, without intent to affect the death of any person, meaning without deliberately trying to kill someone, causes the death of another by perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and evincing a depraved mind. Not or evincing a depraved mind, and evincing a depraved mind, without regard for human life, is guilty of murder in the third degree. So this is from the 2019 Minnesota statutes. And what Chauvin did would be very tough to prove in a court of law as what's called a depraved mind murder. So you can make the case not that the charge should be second degree versus third degree based on the severity, so to speak, of what Derek Chauvin is accused of doing, but because the third degree murder statute includes this depraved mind component. So instead, we have second degree murder here. There are two types of second degree murder in Minnesota statutes: intentional and unintentional. If Chauvin's restraint of George Floyd caused Floyd's death, he could be guilty of unintentional second degree murder, even if he was not trying to kill George Floyd. It would be very difficult to prove in a court of law, based on what we've seen, that Chauvin was trying to kill George Floyd. It seems as though unintentional second degree murder is the statute under which George Floyd's death would fall from the perspective of Derek Chauvin's actions. Now, there's one more analysis here about this that's less about what you can prove, but more about what Chauvin is likely to plead down to. So let me kind of frame this up for you in a different way. If this goes to trial, I think it's going to be tough, but not impossible, to get a guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin. That has nothing to do with my opinion about what went down. It is merely my understanding of how these trials often work and what the law is. So bear with me here. We have two autopsies that were done of George Floyd so far that I've read. In one of those autopsies, the cause of death is not alone the actions of Derek Chauvin. The cause of death says it was not asphyxiation by Derek Chauvin, and it was the restraint used by Derek Chauvin combined with pre-existing medical conditions and possible intoxication. Now, you and I may think that that's BS. And indeed, there's a second autopsy which says something very different, which says that the death was indeed caused by asphyxiation as a result of Derek Chauvin's actions. But my point is, if this goes to trial, a good defense attorney, which Derek Chauvin will certainly have, is very much able to introduce reasonable doubt about whether Chauvin's actions definitely are the cause of George Floyd's death by focusing on the one autopsy that says, there were pre-existing medical conditions that were a factor, possible intoxication, and restraint. You bring in some medical examiner that they'll find and say, Doctor, whoever, given this autopsy, is it possible that absent George Floyd's medical conditions and possible intoxication, that he could have survived the way that he was restrained by Derek Chauvin? Yes, counsel, that's possible. So you and I both understand that this is apparently BS, but you would then have a fight, a legal fight, where the defense is introducing doubt and the prosecution is saying, well, we have a different autopsy. This autopsy does say that George Floyd was asphyxiated by Derek Chauvin, but it becomes a fight. And remember, you only need reasonable doubt to acquit. The standard of evidence in a civil trial may well be a preponderance of evidence. Does it seem like 51% of the evidence points to Derek Chauvin's responsibility? In a criminal trial, you need only introduce reasonable doubt. So this gets me back to the reason for moving from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. Is the idea that you go to a second-degree murder charge because it carries a higher penalty so that you increase the desire from Derek Chauvin to plead to something smaller to avoid a trial altogether, which may or may not go well for the prosecution? That's another possibility as to why you would have seen an elevated charge from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. Needless to say, it is correct to elevate the charge to second-degree murder based on our reading of the Minnesota statutes, and it is a good thing that the other officers have been charged and all were brought in yesterday. This is going to be a very long thing. By every indication, this will not be resolved for far longer than the current protests are likely to go. So we've got to really buckle in and realize that this is going to be a long process. Speedy trial, okay. It is still going to be a long and protracted process.